And we are back with another edition of Kansas City's Northeast Newscast. I'm your host, Paul Thompson, and I'm joined this week by Ingrid Burnett, the District 19 State Rep for the Missouri House of Representatives. Burnett was elected in November of 2016 and has just begun her second session in the legislature. In our conversation, we discuss what she's learned over her first year in Jefferson City. We talk about the first bill she's ever filed, HB 1418, which would increase the penalty for animal abuse from a Class A misdemeanor to a Class E felony. We also discuss the elephant in the room, Governor Eric Greitens, though we don't jump into the salacious details of his personal life. Instead, we talk about the investigation from Josh Hawley, who is looking into the use of Confide, a text messaging app that deletes messages after they're read and prevents users from taking screenshots of messages. Burnett has sponsored House Bill 2059, which addresses how the Sunshine Law relates to data exchange on government-issued cell phones. I ask her about several more bills she's co-sponsored, including one that would allow those over the age of 75 to be excused from jury duty without cause, another to authorize tax credits for contraception costs, and yet another that prohibits discrimination based on a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. We talk a little bit about process, how a bill is created, what happens to it after it's filed, and how a bill goes through the committee process. We also touch briefly on bills seeking to address the limits of lobbyist gifts, a bill hoping to address procedures related to the formation of transportation development districts, which have become popular in Kansas City. And finally, I asked Burnett whether she anticipates anything happening related to short-term rentals, a debate that's going on in Kansas City, Missouri City Hall right now that would create regulations for platforms such as Airbnb and HomeAway. Without further ado, here's my conversation with District 19 State Rep. Ingrid Burnett. All right, Paul Thompson, host of the Northeast Newscast, sitting alongside District 19 Missouri State Rep. Ingrid Burnett. Thank you so much for taking the time today. How are you?
I'm doing well, Paul. Thank you.
And I appreciate the tea. We're sitting
Very
here in
good.
your home, and I'm very thankful for that. So I appreciate you being willing to sit down and being so inviting. To start things off, I just wanted to go ahead and ask you about the state of Jefferson City. Now, do you feel like there's hope for bipartisan legislation this year? That you're getting ready to start your second session, right? Or your second
I'm getting
full
ready to start. We have started the second session. Right now, things are in a bit of a mess due to the shenanigans that are going on around the governor.
And we'll ask you more about that coming up.
Yes. And how that has impacted both parties and terms of it's all so mixed in terms
Right.
there are people in both parties who are calling for a resignation. There are people in both parties who are saying, hold off, wait, we need to get more information, make sure this is true. And there's some uncertainty. There's lots of rumors going around that he's going to resign, and then that will cause a shakeup in the leadership, obviously, and may change the culture. Probably will change the culture if that happens.
Is there a sense that, generally speaking, representatives are in favor of his vision that he's laid out for Missouri?
I didn't hear much vision this time. He talked about helping foster children. Of course, everybody wants to do that. Who's not for helping foster for kids? And he talked about helping veterans. I think and he talked about cutting taxes. And I think, again, on both sides of the aisle, we've got some opposition to any more tax cuts because of the state that our budget is in right now.
Right.
So, depending on if we stay in this state of uncertainty, I think it's going to make it much more difficult to get any legislation pushed through. But if that changes and things stabilize, then there's going to be a change, and I think opportunity for more bipartisan work.
Okay. Now, you So you were elected at the tail end of 2016.
Mm-hmm.
You went through the first term. I think we kind of talked before we started here just about how much comes at you. I think you used the term tsunami of just information that comes just swarming over you when you get down to the Capitol. You've had a chance to kind of soak all that in. What are some of the big lessons you learned during your first year in the legislature?
It's important to talk to people. It's important to talk to people who are on committees with you. It's important to talk to people who are following certain legislation, maybe lobbyists or maybe governmental relations people who are really more associated with associations. So they're not really there to lobby as much as they are there to kind of watchdog and have information for you. That's the biggest thing. Keeping up those lines of communication is really important.
Well, I did want to ask you, you had the opportunity to file your first bill, right? HB 1418, which would increase the penalty for animal abuse from a Class A misdemeanor to a Class E felony. I think there's some language that would rise or increase the penalty for extenuating circumstances, someone who tortures an animal while it's alive, or somebody who's had a second offense or something of that nature.
Second offense, right.
Right. So what kind of a penalty in terms of monetary or potential prison time does a Class E felony carry?
Class E felony is that's the lowest form, and just recently added, actually, just in 2017, January of 2017. And that carries a possible sentence of 4 years in prison, or up to a $10,000 fine.
Wow.
That would be the maximum. It could also just be probation, depending on how the judge determines the sentence. The judge has the authority to impose a sentence that he thinks is, or she thinks is appropriate for.
And a Class A misdemeanor, is that oftentimes lead to a probation or something of that nature?
Yes. So Class A misdemeanor is up to a year in prison, and I think $100 fine.
It seems like it would be pretty rare to serve prison time for a Class A misdemeanor like that, though.
It would be, yes. So I'm doing a little bit of research. It puts animal abuse, intentional animal abuse, in the same category as third-degree domestic assault.
Right. No, yeah, I think that's... Well, I guess I'll ask you, instead of interjecting my opinion here, what kind of response has the bill gotten?
Interesting that you should ask. I really just I did not go there with the intent to do this. I'm not a particular animal advocate, but I was approached by a constituent who asked me to. And I think it's important, as when you're the representative for your district, I think it's important to help your constituents access state government.
Right.
And this is a way to do that. If they come to you and say, could you file this bill, and you think it's reasonable, I think that's a reasonable thing for me to do. I don't know how much influence I'm going to be able to exert over this because we're in the super minority, and the priorities of the majority party are not around protecting animals.
Right. Well, they might not disagree. They're not going to push it to the top of the list, probably.
Right.
Yeah.
But I have heard from people all over the state who have picked this up, who are really, they're really happy that I did this. I haven't heard from anybody yet who's against it. But again,
Seems like it would be a pretty unpopular view.
Who can be against animals, right?
Yeah. You don't want to be on the record, at least.
Puppy dogs and cats. But I really was quite surprised by the people who reached out to me who had heard about it. I didn't think anybody would even notice.
Right.
But
and we mentioned before, there's upwards of 1,000 bills that have been filed. I'm sure it would be easy for things to get lost in the shuffle there. So it's cool that people have reached out to you.
So it may get some play. It may. The next step in that would be to go talk to representatives in other districts, people who would perhaps be on the committee that it gets appointed to, and
essentially try to whip some votes up, right?
See what their interest is. Yes,
Yeah.
if this is something they want to help me with, and if they do, then how do we work together to push it along?
Right, and I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the process of crafting the bill as well, because I'm kind of fascinated by that. You hear from a constituent, they say that they're interested in increasing the penalty for animal abuse. So then what?
So I go down we have a research department, and I go to the research department and I ask them the first thing I asked was for them to see what the penalties are currently, because they might be enough.
Right.
Right.
Just because somebody brings something up doesn't mean they have their facts in a row.
So that was my response to the constituent. I will look into this and I will let you know what I find out. What I found out was that it was a Class A misdemeanor, and that it could be moved up to a Class E felony.
Mm-hmm.
And then the people in research write up a bill, a draft of the bill, and if it's what I want it to be, and this one was pretty simple and straightforward, then you sign it and I go file it with the clerk's office, and then it goes on the list of bills that have been filed. And
so how do you get a bill that you filed into a committee?
well, first you go, so it goes on this list, and in the next day in the House Journal, it's listed as first read. That means it's up there, it's filed, everybody has a chance to read it. Then it gets put on again the next day, and that's called second read. After it's been second read, you can write a letter to the speaker and ask the speaker to assign it to a committee, which is what I did.
Are they obligated to respond?
They're not.
So sometimes I'm sure if it's unpopular or if it's an
Oftentimes,
opposition.
That's where bills die.
Right. You send the letter and they say, let me
Especially
file that, and they throw it in the trash.
The first time it gets filed, especially. Bills that pass usually have been filed for multiple years before they even get a hearing. Especially if they're on big topics, and then they may get a hearing, and so if you get a hearing, then that committee votes on it. If that committee votes it out of committee, it goes back to the speaker and this floor leader, and they decide when it goes on the calendar for the House to discuss. The House then. The first time it's discussed is called perfection. And during that time, amendments can be added or...
Language can be altered.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's all done usually by voice vote. It has to sit then for another 24 hours. And can be read again, called third read. At third read, there's no amendments added. It's an up or down vote. You can still discuss it. But nobody can change it. If it passes through that process, then it goes over to the Senate, where the Senate takes it up in committee, and they go through their own processes. If it makes it through the Senate with no changes, then it goes directly to the governor. If there are changes made, it comes back to the House for the House to approve. If the House doesn't approve the Senate version, then it goes to what's called conference committee, where
sort of like an arbitration of sorts, right?
Senators and House members come together, decide on a version. That version goes to both chambers, where it receives an up or down vote.
So there's an example. Well, here's something from one of the questions down the list here, but I think I'm going to move it forward now because it's kind of relevant to what we're talking about. There are several bills that I saw that have been filed related to the legalization of marijuana, either for medical use. I think most of them are for medical use. But in Kansas City, voters here essentially voted to decriminalize the drug last year by setting the maximum fine for first-time offenders at $25 and kind of classifying it as the lowest priority for KCPD. But what happens in that instance where there's 3-4 bills related to the same subject? Are they directed to work together to put something?
No, they are not directed to work together, and they may not even know about it until they come up for discussion.
You could hypothetically file them simultaneously, right?
You could.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens in that instance typically?
Well, I haven't looked at those particular bills, so I don't know the specifics of what you're asking. But you mean if
three bills tackling the same subject come up at the same time,
and in the same,
does a preferred candidate usually come forward, or does a preferred bill come forward and kind of make the process through the House and to the Senate typically, or can you push forward multiple bills at the same time related to the same subject?
You can.
Does that happen often?
I haven't seen that happen often, but here's an example that we heard in committee. There, in the Education Committee, one bill was a bill to allow for or require that each school district develop an appeal process if their child, if a student doesn't get placed in a gifted and talented program. The parent wants to appeal that. The school district will be required to have an appeal process in place for that. The second bill was to allow for, or was to require school districts to put together, to have a process, to develop a process that would permit students who are in a gifted and talented program to skip a grade. And that bill also included the appeal process. So we passed both.
Okay. So they could both technically be sent to the governor and be passed?
Yes.
Okay. Well, would that create a conflict?
No, because they both say essentially the same thing. So when it then gets written into the state statutes, it just gets written in once.
Okay. Interesting. So there we go. I appreciate the clarification on that one. I also wanted to talk to you about the other bills you've co-sponsored. So you're the sponsor of HB 1418. That's the animal abuse legislation. You co-sponsored HB 2063, which would allow those over the age of 75 to be excused from jury duty without cause. I guess and there's a couple more on here too. HB 2093 was tax credits for contraception costs. HB 2100 prohibits discrimination based on a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. So I guess I just wanted to ask, I asked about the process of crafting your own legislation, but how do you get involved as a co-sponsor?
Oh, that's very easy. You can look at the list of bills. I have an app on my computer that says co-sponsor, and it's just, you can look up bills by who the sponsor is, or by subject, or just look up the whole list if you want to. I also get a copy of the House Journal each day for the day before, and listed in the House Journal are all of the bills that have been first read or second read.
Okay.
And they include in that list bill blah 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 relating to, and then it gives a subject. So I scan it, see if there's a subject there that I'm interested, and then I go look up the bill to see what it says, and then I can go into this co-sponsor app and just click on.
So you don't have to actually even have a dialogue with the sponsor.
I don't.
You can just say, "Oh, that's a good legislation."
Another way to do that, and I've had this happen also, is people might send out emails
saying, "Hey, I'm looking for co-sponsors for this bill," and the more co-sponsors you have, ostensibly would give you a better shot of maybe getting to the floor.
It makes a good, yes, and I think it makes a good talking point when you present it to the committee.
Especially if it's bipartisan, you say, "Hey, I got 8 Republicans and 6 Democrats on board as co-sponsors." I think that shows that there's a willingness, and perhaps that this thing would actually carry enough weight to get through.
And in years past, they say it used to be you had to carry your bill around from person to person to ask for them to co-sponsor it. I've had that happen just a couple of times, and from people who are really passionate about it, and I think that's a good practice. I did that. I filed a resolution to recognize School Counselor Week, and I went to the committee chair of education and asked her, before I even filed it, I went to her and said, getting ready to file this resolution. Can you help me with this? Is this something that you would support? She was very supportive. Absolutely. I offered to let her carry it if she wanted to, and she was very gracious and said, no, it's your idea, you file it, and I'll help you.
Nice.
So when she filed a bill and wrote a letter to the speaker asking for him to move her legislation to committee, she asked that in the same letter that it be sent also with mine to the same committee at the same time. So they could, her bill has to do with counselor, it's much more detailed and substantial than a resolution, but it has to do with counseling programs in the state of Missouri and how they are structured. And so she was just asking that they both be heard in committee at the same, be sent to committee at the same time.
Well,
and it was.
Well, good. And hopefully that one has a decent
I think it does.
There wouldn't be too many roadblocks.
I went to a couple of the Republicans on the committee. I've been to my Democrat colleagues. They've all agreed that they would support it. Then I went to a couple of the Republicans on the committee and asked them if they would be in favor of it, and they have told me yes. I just think, particularly if you're in the minority, that's a good practice.
Right.
To approach the folks who might be suspicious, and it gives you a chance to have a one-on-one conversation. Look, this really is
right. It's not controversial.
Right.
Yeah. And I think it opens up a dialogue. So maybe if they have something that they're looking for bipartisan support for, they'll reach out to you.
Exactly.
And you may, if it's not what if it doesn't fit what you think you or your constituents want, you can say no, but there's a dialogue there.
It opens that door.
Or you can maybe offer an amendment before they get a chance to, before it becomes a fight on the floor, essentially.
Right.
Good. Well, I guess let's no time like the present to get back to the elephant in the room, and I think I would be remiss if I didn't ask you more about Governor Eric Greitens. I will refrain from diving into the salacious details of his personal life, but I did want to talk about the ongoing investigation being conducted by Attorney General Josh Hawley into the use of Confide. So that's a text messaging app that deletes messages after they're read. It also prevents people from taking a screenshot of a message with their phones.
Kind of sneaky, isn't it?
Well, it's called Confide. It seems like that's the point. But yeah, to that end, I saw that one of the bills that you did co-sponsor is HB 2059, which would essentially seems to be addressing exactly the situation. It relates to how the Sunshine Law handles data exchange on government-issued cell phones. So I guess I'll just ask, what have you heard, if anything, about the state of that investigation?
I have not heard anything about where that investigation is. My own experience, though, even on the school board, it wasn't just about the government-issued cell phones or computers. Even on my own personal computer, I was cautioned over and over and over again about what kinds of information I should share in email or in documents, that it's all potentially searchable.
Essentially, it seems like the general rule of thumb is assume that you're just tweeting it right now, and that everybody reads it. And then if you don't think that you want everybody to read it, then don't send it in an email.
Exactly, right.
Don't discuss it.
And even when you're discussing or dealing with official business, even if it's on paper, you have to save a copy.
Right.
But you want to make sure that it's not going to be all mixed up with everything else of your personal stuff. There was a lot of coaching around how to handle that, and none of it included using invisible ink.
Yeah, right. And that's well said. It really is what's happening. You're writing notes to each other with invisible ink, and ostensibly that includes government information being passed back and forth. but I guess that's what this investigation is looking into. But in your opinion, are those text messages that go through the Confide app, should they be considered public records, or are they considered public records right now, or is there some gray area there?
In my opinion, I think they should be considered as public record.
So does that mean using an app that deletes them would be illegal at
Yes,
this point?
I believe so.
But is that what this HB 2059, does that just clarify that then?
I think so, yes.
Because right now I'm assuming there's nothing on the books that relates directly to Confide, right?
And I've learned through the media. And
right.
what the media is reporting is that there's some gray area there.
There's no specific language related to applications that are deleting messages.
Right.
Until now, I guess, and now you propose
and
something.
I think that Representative Albrock that's his point in filing this, is to, okay, then let's make it clear.
If there is some gray area, let's get rid of that. Let's eliminate the gray area and make it, essentially put it on the books.
And I think it's good. We have discussions like this all of the time in committee around bills about, do we really want to say this, or do we want to say it this way? We have changed the place of commas on the House floor through amendments, because once it makes it to the House floor, that's the only way you can.
Right.
We have added commas. We've taken out commas. But, that book, Eat, Shoots, and Leaves, you know what I'm talking about? It's a book on punctuation.
Oh.
And depending on where you put the commas, you're either talking about a terrorist or a panda.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, it's very important.
It is. It is, and so that's why I co-sponsored that piece of legislation. I'm having an education background. I think the words you use are very important.
Well, funny. And on that one, is that something that you've heard anything about in terms of possible momentum?
I haven't. I have not heard anything about it at all. I don't even know what committee it might go through, or if it will be assigned to committee. Again, Mark is one of the Democrats in the super minority, and he has had some pretty controversial appearances in the floor debate. So I don't know how much. I don't know how much support he's going to get, for one thing.
There may be some love lost.
And right, it would depend on him to do the footwork and the legwork.
So I guess we'll see. To be determined.
Right. I have heard of legislators who, they just continue to pester the speaker until he assigns their bills to committees.
Squeaky wheel gets oil. Well, in the interest of not taking up too much of your time, we're coming up on a half hour now.
Okay.
I'll maybe just go through a couple of quick hits and see if you can speak to them at all. HB 1234 would address procedures related to the formation of transportation development districts. Have you heard anything about that? And do you know if that might affect TDDs that are already established in Kansas City? They've been a lot more common. Most recently, Main Street created a TDD for potentially extending the streetcar line southbound. Is that something that you've heard anything about, that HB 1234?
That has not come up yet. I expect that will go through local government committee, which is where I sit. So
you might have a first-hand look at that.
I probably will, and would be happy to share that with you when it comes up.
Good.
I know that's important to people here in Kansas City.
Right, and there's been a lot of TDDs created in Kansas City, so if there is some reform there, I think it could potentially impact Kansas City.
Absolutely, yeah.
I don't know if it would be able to impact ones that have already been created, but people are doing studies and moving that way right now, so I think people would be very interested to find out. Also wanted to ask you about HB 1303. We talked a little briefly about that before we got on the record here. That one would seek to limit lobbyist gifts, and I just wanted to ask briefly how much influence lobbyists have in Jefferson City right now, how big of a factor gifts from lawmakers are, and do you think HB 1303 goes far enough to address that problem, if indeed that one exists?
I think, so that's several different questions.
It is,
I
I'm
think
sorry.
that lobbyists have a lot of influence, and I don't think that's a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think lobbyists their primary service is providing information about how legislation will impact their client.
Mm-hmm.
And I have not ever had a lobbyist come to me and demand that I vote one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
What they've come to offer me is advice
Right.
on this is what we foresee happening, and to tell me conversations that they've had with other legislators and that that are permissible.
Mm-hmm.
I think the bigger problem in terms of ethics and ethics reform has more to do with the dark money campaign contributions.
Right. And how
We are forbidden
prevalent is that?
at the House, and when we are in the Capitol building, we may not discuss, even among ourselves, campaign.
Mm-hmm.
Anything. We cannot use our computers for that. We cannot use our phones for that. We can't use our staff for that. Any conversation or activity that we do that is campaign related must be done outside of the Capitol building.
Okay.
So when you've got, and that's where you interact with the lobbyists is in the building.
Right.
And they are not going to risk.
Right. Their livelihoods.
Right.
They don't want to be featured in a news article
Right.
about impropriety either,
And they don't
right?
want to have that. They don't want to do that to you either, because
It's a working relationship.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that dark money, and they don't give that much. I don't know. Maybe they do. I don't think lobbyists themselves give that much campaign contributions. What they do is let their clients know.
Which way the wind is blowing.
Right. They can
Right.
influence their clients
Right.
to give money. And depending on the kind of rules that we have around it, it can become very secretive very quickly with a tremendous impact. And that's the part I think that we really need to be working on, and nobody seems to have the political will to do it.
Has anybody filed any legislation
No.
related to dark money?
No. And I don't know if you dug into that one or not, but it excludes campaign contributions.
So it's pretty
It's
toothless then, right? Right.
Right.
It's
But
more
it's
about
not
pomp and circumstance than actually reform, isn't it?
It is, and it's not really the lobbyists who give the campaign contributions anyway. It's their principals that they work for. But yes, one of the exclusions as a gift is campaign contributions to their campaign accounts. So, yeah, this is good in.
It looks better than it really is, right?
Yeah.
So I guess you would say it doesn't go far enough then. Yeah.
It really doesn't go far enough.
One of the big issues coming through City Hall right now in Kansas City, and I'll leave it at this one because we just popped over 30 minutes, is short-term rentals, Airbnbs, HomeAway, the services by which are the platforms by which individuals will go travel to another city, and instead of going to a hotel, they'll go stay in somebody's home for usually a lesser fee. But in Kansas City right now, it's kind of a wild, wild west. There aren't laws on the books related to short-term rentals, which means that technically it's illegal in Kansas City. They're working on that, but
yeah, I think
is there
what
anything
we'll
at the
see
legislature?
is an effort to preempt municipalities from enacting ordinances relating to short-term rentals.
And how might they tackle that?
And, well, they would just prohibit that. But then I think is with the intent then to do, if anything, a statewide kind of regulation.
So in that the state can maybe get a piece of the pie in terms of
Partly,
taxes or something of that nature?
Partly that, I'm sure, although it would probably have more to do with fees. But mostly, I think, to have a uniform code across the state. That was the problem that we had with Uber.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's a very similar issue.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
There were instances where you could hire an Uber to take you from one municipality to another, but couldn't do the return trip.
Yeah, because it
Because
wasn't
of the-
prohibited or
Right,
it wasn't
because of
permitted.
the way that they were their ordinances were structured, and it was very confusing and disruptive to the customers and to the drivers.
And it's inconvenience as well. Well, I guess, is there a concern because with the Uber debate and the taxi Uber debate that was going on at City Hall, they kind of struck a deal, and then Uber just went to Jefferson City and struck a new deal with better terms. Is there some concern maybe that the same thing will happen here where
Absolutely.
the city,
Of course
they'll
there
wait to
is.
see what the city does and then say, we can do a little better than that if you grease
That
the wheels
happens all
right.
the time.
Right.
Right. Absolutely. And the other thing I think we need to be careful about is how it affects the hotel industries. And that
That are doing everything right and paying all the fees and are already regulated. Bed and breakfast, to a lesser degree, is the same issue.
right. And that's what, and we ended up giving the taxi drivers a really raw deal, I think, with the Uber bill. So there were some things about that bill that I really did not like. But I think the overall intent is going to be a uniform statewide code.
Well, hopefully Kansas City doesn't get left too much in the dust on that
Right.
one as well. But
Right.
On that note, I just want to say thank you once again. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your willingness to dive into some of these issues, and
Well,
look forward to doing it again.
Yeah.
Right? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
There you have it for this week's edition of Kansas City's Northeast Newscast. Thank you once again to Ingrid Burnett for participating in this week's episode. And, I guess we should say, good luck representing the historic Northeast this session down in Jefferson City. Thanks once again to everybody for listening. This is your host, Paul Thompson, signing out.